I descended onto Radis 9 with a purpose that weighed heavier than the ash-laden air itself. The landing pads were skeletal relics, half melted and warped by some unseen heat, their markings obscured by a layer of blackened cinder. As soon as the servitors guided my transport into the primary intake shaft, the first impossible anomaly confronted me. The molten iron in the vats below flowed upward, defying gravity, writhing like blood in a surgeon's sink. I paused, fingers brushing the glyphs etched into my robes, murmuring the litany of ordination against doubt. Reports had indicated contamination, but nothing in the codices, no manual, no log, no protocol, prepared me for self-aware metal. Servitors moved with halting precision, their optic feeds flickering in patterns that suggested comprehension, hesitation, even fear. One collapsed mid-step, limbs twisting unnaturally, flesh grafted to mechanical appendages in ways the datasheets could not explain. The monitors aboard my transport registered biosigns in places where there should have been nothing but fire and alloy. I ordered the servo harnesses to scan for life and void presence simultaneously. The readings conflicted, as if the very environment rejected measurement. Somewhere beneath the ash-choked sky, a bell tolled without mechanism, and the vibration rippled through my chest like a warp pulse. Time was a luxury I did not have. The planetary governor had dispatched additional engine seers, but their arrival would take hours I could not afford. Each step forward into the intake shaft revealed more deviations. Support beams bent in impossible angles, floors rippling as if they were liquid, shadows that moved independently from their sources. The smell of smoldering sinew and scorched circuitry filled my respirator. I counted every breath, every vibration, every heat signature. It was imperative to remain precise, clinical, but the atmosphere resisted clarity. I activated the secondary observation array, linking all servitor feeds into a single neural interface. Immediately something shifted. One servitor's optics swiveled in a direction opposite to my commands. Its movement was deliberate, contemplative. The internal log showed a record. Personnel missing. Directive incomplete. No timestamps, no data to indicate when or how. I traced the feed to a maintenance hatch below the primary vat, locked, unresponsive to all override attempts. Then, as if in mockery, the hatch sprang open. Nothing emerged. No servitor, no body, no evidence of what could have opened it. Only the smell of burnt ozone and a faint resonance, like the echo of whispered prayer, lingered. My ritualized scans reported fluctuating temperatures inconsistent with the power cores. A localized cold spot, dense, almost tactile, hung around the vats, stealing heat from the molten iron, producing condensation in a place where humidity should not exist. I noted it as an environmental anomaly, though instinct screamed that it was more. I performed the litanies for purity, the hand signs of exorcism and invocation, repeating the hymns of the Omnissiah, but the instruments continued to whisper back a counter-hymn in a language that made no sense. Each step deeper into the intake shaft brought a tactile horror. I ran my gloved hand along a rail, and the metal pulsed like living tissue. Servitors programmed to respond to pressure and heat recoiled, as if the steel itself communicated malevolence. The ceiling vents dripped not condensation but a viscous black fluid that seemed to crawl toward us. I documented everything in my log. The upward-flowing molten iron, the absent laborers, the pulsing steel, the whispering monitors. Protocol demanded objectivity, but the mind struggles when the laws of reality fracture before it. Then I noticed it. An inscription burned into the side of the crucible. Not markings of Mechanicus design, nor Gothic text, but something older than Imperial record. The shapes were geometric, too precise yet curiously organic. My optic lenses recorded them. My mind trembled. There was intelligence here, waiting, watching. I could feel it. The presence of cognition within the metal, whispering at the edges of perception. I ran scans for psychic contamination. Nothing, but instinct told me the void had brushed this place. Comms blinked erratically. Intermittent signals from the planetary governor's network arrived with fragments of garbled text. Containment compromised. Recall all, and then silence. The ash outside whipped against the landing pads, scraping the hull like fingernails on bone. My retinue of engineers and servitors remained orderly, yet tension pulsed in their motions. One servo arm twitched in a way that suggested awareness. I cannot overstate the weight of that observation. These machines had never erred. They were designed for obedience, yet here they hesitated. Here they feared. I took a measured breath and descended further into the belly of the forge. The heat of molten metal licked at my robes even from a distance. The smell of burnt flesh intensified. My servitors scuttled along beside me, sensors detecting anomalies that I could barely comprehend. And then I saw movement in the corner of my vision, a shadow that should not exist. Not human, not machine, not servitor. It flickered, vanishing when I looked directly at it. Yet the echo remained. The sound of metal clanging against metal, a rhythm like a heartbeat. A whisper that shaped itself into a cadence I had never learned but somehow understood. The hatch ahead, the one previously open, shuddered again. A faint light pulsed from within the void beyond, as if the interior of the shaft itself breathed. I felt the weight of inevitability settle in my chest. I knew, with the clarity of dread, that whatever lurked within this forge was no simple contamination. It had awareness. It had patience. And it had already begun to rewrite the rules of this place. I issued a command to the servitors to advance. They obeyed, but in the back of my mind I knew the truth. We were not entering a forge. We were entering a maw, a mouth waiting to consume everything we thought we understood about reality, machinery, and life itself. And in that instant, I realized the first member of my team had disappeared. No scream, no trace, simply gone. The only evidence, a whisper in the comm feed repeating over and over, "We are hungry." The echo of the vanished servitor haunted my steps as we advanced deeper into the forge. My retinue of engineers followed silently, servos whirring in the uneasy rhythm of fear and duty. The intake shaft had given way to a cavernous processing chamber, one that should have obeyed the principles of thermodynamics. Yet the molten iron continued to flow upward, licking the air as if drawn by an unseen hand. I measured the flux with all available instruments. Nothing explained it. The readings oscillated between impossible temperatures, alternating between the heat of starfire and the cold of the void itself. A pungent odor of decay mixed with burning metal filled the chamber, and I forced my lungs to filter through the respirator's purifiers. The smell was familiar, though I could not place it. Partially human, partially machine, entirely wrong. My optic sensors captured flashes of movement, apparitions that melted into the shadows when observed directly. One engineer hesitated, hand trembling as he reached to adjust a sensor. I noticed the veins in his forearm pulse in synchronization with a vibration emanating from the molten vats. The rhythm was not mechanical. It was biological, yet amplified across the chamber, resonating through the metal structure itself. I commanded a full environmental scan. Data flooded the neural interface, revealing anomalies in every subsystem. Gravity shifts, temperature reversals, auditory spikes in the ultrasonic range, and magnetic fields twisting unpredictably. Each reading contradicted the others. I documented everything meticulously, but intuition whispered the logs would fail to capture the true nature of the corruption. Something alive had claimed this place, and it learned faster than we could measure. We approached the first crucible. Servitors had been reduced to charred husks, their metal limbs fused with the surrounding slag. The bodies were not merely burned, they had been rewritten, reconstructed, grafted into the architecture of the forge itself. I ran a ritual diagnostic on one of the remnants, expecting error codes, contamination reports, perhaps a glitch in the manufacturing protocol. The servitor replied, "Not with audio, not with servos, but with thought. A flicker in the neural net. We hunger. We rise." The chamber pulsed and the molten iron twisted into shapes that were simultaneously human and mechanical. My optic sensors struggled to maintain focus. Limbs formed where none existed, torsos elongating impossibly, heads melting into machinery that remembered consciousness. I blinked and the shapes vanished, leaving only metal and ash. My mind protested the incomprehensibility, yet I forced the observance of every detail, tracing geometric patterns etched into the walls. What had been simple conduits now traced the contours of rib cages and vertebrae, motifs repeated across the chamber, a liturgical calculus of metal and flesh. I ordered the engineers to separate and investigate peripheral sectors, careful to maintain a perimeter. Each corridor revealed variations on the same theme. Servitors fused into scaffolding, data logs rewritten with pseudo-living glyphs, and the air itself carrying whispers I could not parse. I recorded them phonetically: Takal, fresh, consume, repeat. No one responded when I asked if they heard it. Only the monitors confirmed my perception. Something in this forge existed partially outside our comprehension, both machine and warp anomaly, and it knew we were cataloging its existence. In a maintenance alcove, I discovered partial human remains interlaced with mechanical filaments. Muscle tissue had been grafted to alloy plates. bone fused to servitor chassis. The horror of what had occurred here demanded a pause, a ritual to cleanse the senses. I chanted the Ordo Machina litany, tracing a sigil of purification in the air. The vitals of the corpses pulsed faintly in response, as if acknowledging my prayer, then faltered. The sense of a watching presence intensified. I could feel it tracking, learning, testing. Telemetry reported unusual energy fluxes from beneath the main crucibles. I followed them, accompanied by 2 engine seers, into an access tunnel that should have led to auxiliary support systems. It did not. The walls of the tunnel seemed to contract, pulse, and breathe. My servitors whirred nervously, their movement hesitating as though reluctant to enter. The tunnel ended at a hatch scorched and deformed. I attempted override. The system responded not with denial, but with a pulse of heat that burned through my gloves. The hatch trembled as if alive. A whisper, intelligible now, brushed the edge of comprehension. "Join us." The engine seers froze, hands gripping tools that seemed inadequate against the rising pressure of the environment. My instruments reported a rapid increase in biological mass inside the hatch, yet no movement was visible. The sound of metal scraping metal echoed from behind the steel barrier. Then one of the engine seers vanished. No scream, no trace, only the faint vibration in the floor and a flicker on the neural interface where his feet had been. His vitals remained, yet they had been absorbed into the structure, rewritten as data and matter simultaneously. A sudden resonance shook the chamber, and I stumbled, bracing against a conduit. The molten iron convulsed, forming a shape vaguely human, but impossibly elongated and angular. Eyes, if they could be called that, opened along its metallic limbs, scanning, calculating. My own optic feed flickered with a whispering code. "We are hunger. We are the forge." I recorded it verbatim, heart hammering, knowing this entry alone would seem heretical to any tribunal reading it later. I realized the microgravity in the tunnel was fluctuating. My robes weighed differently. My body pulled in conflicting directions. I forced my mind back to procedure. Map anomalies, record every deviation, maintain strict observation. The air itself seemed to thicken, particulate matter clinging to every exposed surface. Ash moved against airflow as if directed by some unseen force. The metal floor beneath me rippled like liquid, and my servitors emitted warnings I could not interpret. I took another step forward, toward the hatch. The whispering intensified, shaping itself into words I could almost understand. "Bring the flesh, complete the pattern, worship the void." My fingers tightened around the data slate. Logic told me to retreat, to request immediate extraction, yet curiosity, blended with the weight of duty, propelled me forward. The hatch quivered again, and for a fraction of a second, I glimpsed the face of a human within the molten metal, silent, pleading, yet part of the forge. Then the hatch slammed open with a force that rattled the chamber, empty, save for the shadow of something moving too fast to register. The whispering ceased abruptly. Only the pulse remained, a resonance of hunger, awareness, and patience. My hand hovered over the hatch release. I knew that crossing that threshold would entangle me further with this abomination, yet the logs demanded observation. I activated the secondary neural link, recording everything before entering. As I stepped closer, the temperature dropped sharply, frost forming along the edges of my robes. The vats continued their impossible flow upward, blackened smoke spiraling like the exhalation of some great organism. Something brushed the back of my neck, cold, tactile, deliberate. I dared not turn. A single thought flickered in my mind. The missing engine seer was here, or what he had become. I took the final step toward the hatch, and the chamber shifted beneath my feet. The molten metal rippled as though alive. My neural interface flashed with a glyph I had seen in the crucible. Organic, geometric, impossible. And then, just as I reached for the threshold, the whisper returned. "We are hungry." The hatch yielded under my hand. But crossing its threshold was not stepping into a room. It was stepping into a living calculus of metal, flesh, and void. The chamber beyond stretched impossibly, walls bending as though viewed through warped lenses. The molten iron, still flowing upward, had pooled into shapes vaguely humanoid, pulsing with a rhythm that matched my own heartbeat. Or perhaps it imposed one upon me. My neural interface struggled to interpret the readings. Temperature, density, mass, all fluctuating, oscillating between extremes that should have annihilated any life form in proximity. Servitors advanced ahead of me, their movements deliberate, yet hesitant. One paused abruptly, tilting its optic array to scan a wall where a geometric pattern had formed from rivulets of molten metal. The shapes resembled vertebrae, ribs, and segments of skull fused seamlessly to conduits and girders. I noted the recurrence of this motif. It appeared in crucibles, tunnels, and now across the chamber walls, almost ritualistic. Something, or someone, was teaching the forge a language, an anatomy of devotion and consumption. I directed the engineers to scan for warp interference. Readings surged beyond the calibration of their instruments. Magnetic distortions warped the air. Electromagnetic flux created a faint hum that penetrated neural implants directly. My servitors twitched in synchrony with it, as if attuned to the resonance. Every metallic surface seemed to vibrate, and in the echoing rhythm I thought I heard whispered hymns. At first it was subtle, unintelligible, a low murmur, then it resolved into discernible syllables. Takal, Vrash, merge, complete. The chamber itself was singing, and we were the audience. I approached one of the upward-flowing crucibles. Heat licked my robes from every angle, yet a cold draft spiraled through the same space. I touched the molten metal with a stylized augmetic probe, expecting resistance. Instead, it pulsed against my sensors, pushing back as if it were aware of my examination. The probe returned data indicating life forms nested within the flow. Not mechanical life, not human, but a hybrid, flesh and alloy coexisting in a state of constant reconstruction. One fragment of data suggested a servitor's consciousness persisted inside a molten vein, twitching in alignment with the pulse of the chamber. A hiss erupted from the shadows. I pivoted, hand gripping the data slate, and saw movement that defied comprehension. A shadow detached itself from a wall, forming limbs and torso from thin air, then dissolving into molten rivulets. The engineers froze, one muttering prayers for the Omnissiah while scanning the anomaly with trembling fingers. I could feel the chamber observing us. Every step we took was anticipated. Every instrument reading was not just captured but consumed, remade into something alien and incomprehensible. The chamber's floor buckled beneath us, not collapsing but twisting like sinew. I ordered a halt, heart hammering, while I attempted to trace the source of the resonance. It was not located, not anchored to a point. It emanated from the entirety of the forge, each wall, each crucible, each corridor vibrating in a singular, horrific pulse. The sensory layering overwhelmed my synaptic implants. Sound and heat collided with the sight of pulsing metal, forming a hallucination I knew to be external rather than internal. We advanced toward an observation balcony overlooking the main vats. The view was staggering. Servitors, once obedient, now writhed in molten metal, their movements rhythmic, ritualistic. Occasionally the shapes would merge, forming taller, more complex structures that simulated worship, then collapse back into flowing alloy. A faint, corrosive mist rose from the floor, and my respirator detected traces of organic compounds not yet catalogued by the Mechanicus. I logged every detail, but I knew mere observation was insufficient. Something here responded to scrutiny, adapting, evolving. Then the microgravity fluctuations returned, this time in violent pulses. My robes and implants alternately floated and were pressed to the floor. The upward-flowing iron formed tendrils that reached toward us, pulsing with light that resembled eyes. My optic sensors failed repeatedly as shapes coalesced into something humanoid, yet impossibly elongated. Each movement was deliberate, intelligent, and menacing. The whispers intensified, forming a chorus: consume, complete. We are hunger. The engineers flinched as one of the tendrils brushed past, leaving a faint scorch where no flame should have been. I documented the anomaly, attempting to remain clinical, but the chamber rejected analysis. My neural link reported anomalous patterns repeating every 47 seconds, numerical sequences embedded in the flow, like a heartbeat counting something unknown. Motifs from the crucibles and tunnels now aligned with these sequences, forming a ritualistic lattice. The forge was no longer a facility. It was a liturgical organism, feeding on metal, flesh, and faith alike. Suddenly, a sound erupted from behind, a scream, or the echo of a scream captured and projected through the metal. I turned. The hatch behind us quivered. A pulse of heat and pressure rolled outward, nearly toppling the servitors. Then silence. I peered into the void beyond the hatch. The missing engineer, the one lost in the access tunnel, appeared, but not as he had been. His form flickered, half machine, half molten flesh, limbs forming and dissolving into the surrounding structure. His gaze met mine. There was recognition, intelligence, but also a profound alien hunger. I could not retreat. Protocol demanded further observation, but instinct screamed that every second increased risk. The molten tendrils moved subtly, responding to our presence, forming barriers and openings as if channeling us along a path preordained by the anomaly. I recorded the coordinates, the resonance frequencies, the visual data, an entire archive of impossible physics and warp taint. The chamber pulsed again, and in that moment the whispering clarified, "You will serve. You will complete. We hunger." I took a step forward and the floor beneath me shivered. The crucibles below erupted, spewing molten metal upward in arcs, forming temporary sculptures of servitors and humans, frozen in grotesque ritual. Each sculpture mimicked the gestures of worship, then dissolved back into the molten flow. My neural interface struggled to track all variables. Environmental and psychic data collided. Sensory input scrambled, and for a moment, I understood. The forge itself was a sentient liturgy, and we were its participants, whether willing or not. Then the hatch behind me slammed with a force that reverberated across the chamber. The missing engine seer, or what he had become, stood partially fused into the metal, staring. His mouth moved in a silent plea, but the whispering continued, louder, clearer, insistent. "We hunger." I braced against the floor as the chamber shifted. Gravity, temperature, and resonance pulsed violently. My recordings continued automatically, but I could no longer trust my own perception. The forge had learned observation. It had assimilated our presence into its calculus. I understood finally that leaving this chamber might be impossible, yet I had to try. I issued the servitors forward to recon the next corridor, their movement hesitant, synchronized to the rhythm of the chamber. As they advanced, the geometric motifs on the walls shifted, forming a pattern unmistakably familiar. Human anatomy twisted into liturgical geometry. I recognized the underlying ritual: consumption, fusion, worship. The forge was teaching itself devotion, using metal and flesh as scripture. As I prepared to follow, the chamber pulsed violently once more. A tendril of molten metal shot toward the far wall, splitting in midair, forming a humanoid shape that waved, or beckoned. The whisper returned, repeating in the same cadence as before. "We are hunger. We are waiting. You are next." My heart hammered, but I forced the step forward. There was no choice. Observation, documentation, survival intertwined. And as I crossed into the next corridor, the air shifted. The hiss of molten metal was joined by a low chant in a language I had never learned but somehow understood. The forge was alive, and it was calling to us. The corridor twisted beneath my feet, not in the geometry of architecture, but in the pulse of something alive. Each step revealed walls breathing imperceptibly, a rhythm synchronized to the low hum of molten metal from the crucible chambers below. I activated the ritualized diagnostic protocols, hand tracing the symbols of purification across my robes. The data slate hummed with an unnatural resonance, capturing the sequence of anomalies, heat spikes, microgravity fluctuations, and the subtle twitch of metal sinews across walls and floors. Each metric reinforced the impossible truth. This forge was no longer a place of production. It had become sentient. Servitors followed, hesitant, their optic sensors flickering with unreadable patterns. One paused near a wall where the molten flow had spilled, forming shapes that resembled the limbs of laborers. The appendages twitched as if testing for contact, then fused seamlessly with the surrounding steel. I issued a command to scan for biological traces. The readings were horrifying. Partial human tissue, sinew, and bone had been integrated into the structural framework. Not a contamination, a deliberate grafting. Someone, or something, was consuming flesh and encoding it into the forge's mechanics. I pressed deeper, hand on the hilt of my arcane diagnostic tool. The temperature oscillated violently, alternating between the heat of molten iron and a chilling void-like cold that seeped into my bones. The air itself seemed viscous, tugging at my robes and respirator. The whispering had returned, layered this time, echoing from multiple directions. It was intelligible, repeating the same phrase with slight variations. "We are the forge. We are hunger. Join the pattern." I noted the ritual cadence, a liturgical grammar encoded into matter and sound. Approaching a secondary crucible, I witnessed the first full fusion of flesh and machinery. A servitor that had been assigned to haul molten metal lay partially absorbed into the flow. Limbs and sinew merged with conduits, spinal vertebrae intertwined with pipes. Its optic sensors flickered with autonomous movement, aware, intelligent. I recorded every detail, heart-hammering, knowing that the Mechanicus archives would declare this impossible, or heretical. My gloved hand hovered over a control panel. Logic dictated removal. Instinct whispered observation. I activated the secondary neural array, overlaying sensory data from all servitors. Immediately, the interface pulsed violently, projecting partial images of missing personnel, their faces embedded in molten rivulets, eyes blinking in synchronization with the chamber's pulse, each visage twisted as though conscious, screaming silently through the veil of alloy and flame. I closed my optic lenses briefly, muttering the Ordo Machina litany to maintain mental stability. When I opened them, the images remained, now forming a grotesque lattice that spanned the walls, floors, and ceiling. A hiss erupted from the crucible as molten metal reshaped itself, forming humanoid torsos that reached upward in a mockery of prayer. Their hands fused together, then melted back into rivulets. The geometric patterns repeated, echoing those found in the intake shaft and secondary tunnels. I recognized the motif as a ritual of devotion, but not to the Omnissiah or any imperial deity. This was a new liturgy, encoded in flesh, alloy, and heat, a perverse communion between matter and consciousness. I ordered the engine seers to deploy additional probes, mapping biological and mechanical integration across the chamber. One probe returned readings of neural activity inside the metal flow. The servitor's mind, or what remained of it, had been rewritten as part of the forge's consciousness. I tried to step closer, but a sudden pulse of gravity slammed me to the floor, rippling through my robes and implants. The corridor itself seemed to flex, an intelligent compression meant to disorient, to assert control. The whispering grew louder, layered over the rhythmic pulse of the molten crucibles. I could now detect multiple sources, as if the chamber itself had divided consciousness into nodes, each observing, adapting. A faint voice emerged amidst the chorus, familiar yet warped, one of my own engine's ears, missing from the intake shaft, reciting a garbled hymn. The tone was mechanical, fused to the resonance of the metal. It was him yet not him. His humanity had been partially absorbed, encoded into the living structure. I initiated a containment analysis, attempting to establish boundaries of influence. Readings spiked. A wall panel flexed, forming a hand that reached toward my neural link. The whisper repeated, "Join us. Complete the pattern." My servitors recoiled, one jerking violently as if rejecting a command. The corridor shifted, closing off segments and opening new passages, guiding us deeper into the heart of the forge. It was deliberate, ritualized. The forge had an intent. Sweat and ash coated my robes as I advanced. The air was thick, laden with the scent of burning flesh and heated metal. I observed another fusion. An engine seer, partially integrated, sinews grafted to conduits. His eyes met mine, flickering between recognition and alien awareness. He extended a hand, not to beg, not to resist, but as part of the pattern. My instruments recorded neural activity, merging with the forge's own resonance. I could see the beginnings of a lattice network, connecting all integrated matter across the chamber. A sudden tremor shook the floor. The molten crucibles erupted, spewing twisted shapes upward. Some resembled humans, some servitors, all in grotesque ritualistic forms, merging and dissolving back into the flow. The whispering reached a crescendo. We hunger. We consume. We rise. I forced myself to step back, documenting each fluctuation. Every pulse, every fusion, every pattern was recorded. The forge was learning from us, anticipating observation, assimilating presence into its ever-expanding ritual. Then I noticed movement beyond the crucible, something not fully flesh, not fully machine, standing upright, observing us. Its head was vaguely humanoid, its body a lattice of alloy and sinew. Geometric motifs etched into its chest and limbs. The missing engine seer? Partially. The crucible shapes? Partially. Yet the entity radiated intelligence beyond any mind I had catalogued. It paused, gesturing with a tendril that split into multiple fingers, beckoning. I stepped closer, hand hovering over the data slate. The corridor pulsated, whispering in unison, "Join, complete, merge, worship." I understood then that the forge was not merely corrupted. It was performing a liturgical act of creation and assimilation. Every moment delayed brought us closer to becoming part of the pattern. I realized the first choice had been made for me: observe, document, survive, or become integrated. As I activated the neural array to capture the entity, the floor beneath me pulsed violently, and the corridor walls flexed, enclosing us in a womb of metal and flesh. The whisper repeated one final time before we advanced into the next chamber. "We are hunger. We await the next step." The deeper we moved into the heart of the forge, the more the laws of reality seemed to dissolve around us. Gravity shifted unpredictably. Heat surged and vanished within heartbeats, and the very air carried a metallic tang that clawed at the lungs. I forced myself to focus on the data slate, recording every fluctuation, every tremor, every aberration. Yet the readings were no longer coherent. Instruments contradicted themselves, displaying impossibilities as fact. The forge was no longer a machine, no longer a facility. It had become a predator, alive and aware, feeding on everything that entered it. I paused at the threshold of a crucible chamber, frozen in disbelief. Within the molten vats, shapes writhed, human, servitor, hybrid, but none static. Limbs extended, retracted, merged and separated. Faces emerged, eyes wide, screaming silently, then dissolved into the alloy as if swallowed whole. The realization struck with the clarity of a knife. These were not accidents. The forge was consuming laborers deliberately, converting flesh and consciousness into extensions of itself. My hand tightened over my robes, instinct and protocol at odds. Observation demanded documentation, but morality whispered warnings my logic could not silence. The engine seers behind me hesitated, their movements slower, tremulous. One pointed toward a wall where patterns formed spontaneously, a lattice of bone, conduit, and molten metal. I recognized the motif from prior chambers, repeated and amplified. Vertebrae merged with piping, hands with servitor appendages, all aligned in a ritual geometry I could not interpret. Yet there was intent here, a design, deliberate and methodical. I ordered the engine seers to record, but even as they obeyed, the walls pulsed, subtly rearranging themselves, hiding some details while revealing others. The forge observed our documentation, shaping itself in response. I attempted a ritual diagnostic, tracing my fingers along sigils etched into my robes, chanting litanies of the Omnissiah. The crucible pulsed in reply, almost conversationally. Thermal readings spiked, moisture condensed and evaporated instantly around us. The whispering returned, layered, intelligible in fragments. We hunger, complete, integrate, rise. It was a language of assimilation, not of instruction. I realized that the forge was forming a network, a lattice of intelligence that incorporated matter, energy, and consciousness alike. Each consumed life added to its awareness. A tremor passed through the floor, and from the molten depths, one form separated. A hybrid, half servitor, half human, limbs fused into conduits and plates. It moved deliberately, eyes glowing with warped intelligence. I documented every detail. The fusion of sinew and alloy, the pulse of consciousness detectable in neural arrays, the alignment with geometric motifs. Then shockingly it turned toward me and spoke not in words but in thought, an echo in my mind. We are hunger. You will feed the pattern. The engine seers recoiled, servitors twitching. I noted the partial moral dilemma. To destroy this entity might mean destroying what remained of the engine seers it had assimilated, or attempting containment would risk further integration. Both options were dangerous. I ran simulations on the data slate, modeling potential outcomes. The forge, however, anticipated the calculations, altering the flow of molten metal mid-analysis, forming barriers that blocked our retreat. It was adaptive, learning from observation, responding to intention. Observation itself had become a tool in its liturgy. I directed probes into the molten veins. Data returned indicating neural activity, synaptic patterns partially intact, but now synchronized with the forge's rhythm. Faces flickered in the flow, human, servitor, hybrid, all aware, all integrated. I could trace fragments of memory, orders obeyed, rituals performed, all feeding into a pattern I could not yet comprehend. I understood then that the forge was performing a ritual of creation through consumption, a liturgy of metal and flesh. Every life absorbed became part of its worship, its intelligence, its design. Environmental anomalies intensified. Gravity reversed briefly, forcing me to anchor against a conduit. Temperature spiked in bursts. Moisture crystallized mid-air, and auditory sensors detected multiple simultaneous sources, producing a layered cacophony of mechanical and organic sound. The chamber itself seemed to breathe, flex, anticipate. The geometric motifs had begun forming spirals, leading from crucible to crucible, from wall to ceiling, forming a pattern across the entire structure. It was a map. It was a ritual. It was alive. A sudden vibration forced me to step back. The hybrid entity moved closer, reaching with appendages composed of alloy and sinew. The whispering in my mind grew louder, now forming phrases I understood clearly. Integrate, complete, serve the forge. The entity's pulse resonated with my neural link, probing for comprehension, testing my resolve. I felt my own body resist, instinct screaming retreat, duty demanding observation, conscience whispering terror. Each moment delayed risked our absorption into the pattern. I ordered the engine seers to maintain distance while recording. One probe returned with a horrifying readout. A former engineer, partially consumed, had begun to encode instructions into the molten metal, effectively creating new operational protocols for the forge. The patterns were intelligible to no one alive, yet perfectly executed. The forge was writing itself into being, learning, evolving, and converting life into function. I realized the implications. This was no mere anomaly. It was sentient, adaptive, and limitless. Then a sudden surge of resonance emanated from the floor. The molten iron erupted into a sculpture, forming a humanoid figure complete with the faces of my missing engine seers. They screamed silently, arms raised as if invoking some deity, then dissolved back into the crucible. The whispering clarified, "All will feed the pattern. All will serve. None will escape." I understood the gravity of the situation. The forge was not contained. It could not be destroyed by conventional means. Survival alone would require extreme measures, possibly sacrifice. I paused, recording my observations with trembling hands. My neural interface was filled with sensory data beyond comprehension. Thermal inversions, biological integration, geometric liturgies, and psychic resonance. I knew that proceeding further would either yield critical intelligence or ensure our assimilation. The chamber pulsed again, and a corridor ahead opened, lined with tendrils of molten metal forming skeletal motifs. The whispering repeated one last time, "We hunger. We await the next step." The moral choice loomed. Do we attempt containment at the risk of integration, or withdraw and leave the forge to evolve unchecked? I had no answers, only logs, sensory records, and a creeping understanding that the anomaly was far beyond Imperial control. Each second delayed drew us deeper into the ritual, into the pattern, into the hunger, and as I advanced toward the next corridor, I could feel the pulse of the forge synchronizing with my heartbeat. Resistance was optional. Comprehension was mandatory. The corridor beyond the crucible chamber opened into a space that was not architectural, but organic in intent. The walls flexed like sinew, ribs of metal and flesh interwoven into lattices I could barely comprehend. The molten metal pulsed rhythmically, echoing my own heartbeat, or imposing one upon me. Every breath carried a metallic tang. Every step forced me to navigate a floor that quivered beneath the illusion of solidity. My servitors advanced cautiously, their optic sensors flickering with unreadable patterns. Each one hesitated, as though sensing a predator far larger than any we could confront. I paused near a newly formed assembly of fused flesh and alloy. Limbs protruded from conduits, sinew stretched between girders and faces. Human, servitor, unknown, emerged briefly before melting into molten rivulets. A low vibration emanated from the chamber, resonating through my neural implants, layering sensory information with an almost musical cadence of horror. I traced my fingers along the edge of a molten arm, recording temperature, density, and neural activity. The readings were beyond standard calibration. The hybrid had intelligence, awareness, and memory. It remembered its former self even as it was rewritten into the forge. The engine seers followed at a cautious distance, their hands gripping tools useless against the environmental instability. One emitted a soft prayer, only to have the whispering chorus of the forge answer. "Join, complete, serve the pattern." The words reverberated in the chamber, a command and a liturgy simultaneously. The geometric motifs on the walls shifted subtly, forming spirals and grids that aligned with the movements of the hybrids. Each assembly seemed to act with purpose, performing a ritual I could not yet interpret. Observation itself had become an instrument in the forge's liturgy. He advanced further, my robes brushing against walls that pulsed with faint warmth. The floor beneath me shivered violently, then formed appendages from molten alloy and sinew that reached upward, as if testing for resistance. A servitor ahead recoiled, half of its optic array snapping and twitching erratically. I scanned the appendages. Sensory nodes indicated the presence of integrated consciousness. Every step revealed more fusions. Bodies of missing engine seers intertwined with conduits, metal plates grafted seamlessly to muscle, and neural pathways linked to the crucible network. The forge was converting life into infrastructure, rewriting existence itself. A hiss erupted from the central assembly. Limbs of metal and flesh shifted, forming humanoid torsos that writhed like serpents, their heads mimicking prayer. Eyes blinked with intelligence and recognition. I activated a ritual diagnostic, tracing sigils in the air while chanting the Omnissiah litany. The chamber responded. Temperature spikes, microgravity fluctuations, and a sudden oscillation of sound that penetrated neural implants directly. My servitors flinched, yet maintained formation. The pattern was deliberate, calculated, a combination of observation, adaptation, and worship. I reached the heart of the assembly, a massive hybrid construct, taller than any human, composed of intertwined flesh and machinery, eyes blinking across its chest and limbs. The geometric motifs etched into its structure mirrored those found throughout the forge. Neural scans indicated partial human memory, synaptic firing, and residual obedience, but entirely subsumed by the entity's new intelligence. I understood then that this was not simply a creature. It was a priest, a congregation, and an altar all at once, performing a liturgical act of assimilation through consumption. The environmental hazards intensified. Gravity shifted violently, forcing me to anchor against a conduit. The air thickened, particulate matter floating unnaturally. My implants reported multiple sources of resonance, producing a layered cacophony of mechanical and organic sound. The hybrids moved with purpose, limbs and torsos twisting to form ritualistic gestures, then dissolving back into the molten lattice. The whispering chorus spoke in unison. We hunger. We consume. We rise. Observation alone was insufficient. The forge learned from our attention. A pulse surged through the chamber. The central hybrid extended multiple appendages toward us, bifurcating as it reached. My neural interface registered thought communication, probing comprehension, intent, and fear. The whispering became distinct. Complete the pattern. All serve. None escape. The engineers flinched, stepping back, but retreat was impossible. Each corridor closed behind us, reshaped by the forge's will. The chamber had become a womb of metal and flesh, trapping us within the liturgical ritual. I attempted to trace escape routes, scanning the structural lattice. Data indicated partial collapses in some sectors, yet other paths opened spontaneously, guided by the hybrid's actions. The forge was shaping a route not for us but through us, testing, observing, assimilating. I realized the moral dilemma. To destroy these constructs might require the annihilation of integrated engineers, yet failure to act risked our own absorption. Survival required understanding, observation, and calculated inaction. Another hybrid detached itself from the central mass, moving with deliberate intelligence. Its limbs ended in bifurcated fingers, tracing motifs along the walls as if performing ritual maintenance. I could feel its awareness probing my mind, assessing my intentions, evaluating my threat. Every micro-movement, every recorded thought became part of its calculation. I documented meticulously limb structure, neural resonance, geometric alignment, thermal variance. Yet even as I recorded, I knew the forge had observed us, adapted, integrated our presence into its liturgy. A sudden tremor rippled through the chamber. The molten crucibles convulsed, ejecting shapes that mimicked humans and servitors performing worship, only to dissolve into rivulets. The whispering intensified. We hunger. Integrate. Serve the forge. I felt the pulse of the central hybrid synchronize with my own heartbeat, a literal and psychological tether. The corridor ahead opened, lined with tendrils forming skeletal motifs that beckoned us forward. Observation, survival, and duty compelled the step. Resistance had become optional. Comprehension was mandatory. I advanced, documenting every fluctuation, every fusion, every whisper. The hybrids moved in unison, performing an act of worship I could not comprehend, yet understood in essence: consumption, integration, and devotion. The chamber itself pulsed with intelligence, alive and aware, and the whispering repeated one final chilling phrase as we moved into the next corridor. We hunger. We await the next step. We entered a cavern unlike any structure the Mechanicus had catalogued. The corridor opened into a chamber of impossible scale, its ceiling disappearing into shadows beyond optic range. A faint, otherworldly light radiated from the far end, casting long, grotesque silhouettes of the hybrids that had begun to dominate the forge. The air was thick, resonating with vibrations that penetrated neural implants directly. My hand clutched the data slate, recording anomalies, thermal inversions, gravity flux, auditory layering, and the unmistakable pulse of conscious design. This place was no longer bound by human engineering. It was a temple to an alien liturgy of flesh, metal, and thought. The hybrids moved deliberately, limbs bifurcating and merging with conduits along the walls. Faces flickered within the molten metal, some familiar, others unknown, all aware, all watching. The whispering chorus returned, amplified and intelligible. Complete the pattern. Integrate. Serve. Each syllable resonated with a rhythm that synchronized with the crucibles, with the floor beneath our feet, with my own heartbeat. Observation was no longer passive. It was an act of participation. I stepped forward, hand hovering over the interface, and noted a warp signature, unlike anything previously recorded. It pulsed through the chamber, subtle but undeniable, overlaying reality with faint distortions. Shadows detached from objects, reflections warped independently, and the ambient temperature oscillated in impossible cycles. Microgravity shifts became violent, forcing me to anchor against a conduit while molten rivulets shifted beneath us, forming and reforming humanoid shapes. The forge was aware of its influence in real time, altering environmental parameters in response to our presence. The engine seers behind me murmured prayers, their hands gripping tools inadequate for the scale of aberration before us. One pointed to a central crucible where molten metal had pooled into a massive, humanoid form. Its limbs were fully articulated, faces embedded in torsos, eyes blinking in conscious recognition. Neural scans indicated a fusion of human memory and warp-touched intelligence, operating under a logic entirely alien. The forge was not merely consuming, it was learning, evolving, performing a ritual that integrated matter, consciousness, and psychic resonance. I activated the secondary neural array, overlaying sensory feeds from all servitors. Immediately, the interface registered multiple independent loci of consciousness within the crucible. Data patterns suggested partial awareness of prior observers, including missing engine seers and servitors. It was as if the forge were cataloging experience, assimilating memory, and encoding it into its hybrid forms. Every action we performed, every observation became a part of the liturgical calculus. The whispering intensified. All will feed. All will serve. None will escape. A sudden tremor forced me to brace against the wall. Molten limbs extended from the crucible, probing outward like sensing instruments. A servitor flinched, optic sensors failing intermittently as if aware of the threat before it could act. The ambient light shifted, revealing partial glyphs etched into walls that were not mechanical or human in origin. These glyphs pulsed with a subtle energy, resonating with the crucible and the hybrids, forming a ritual lattice. Observation revealed that each glyph functioned as a conduit for warp influence, channeling psychic resonance into the forge. I directed probes toward the lattice, attempting to map energy flows. The crucible pulsed violently in response. Molten rivulets twisted into shapes that mimicked human laborers performing worship, only to collapse back into liquid metal. The hybrids moved in synchrony, executing gestures that aligned with the glyphic patterns. The whispering now formed partial phrases intelligible to the mind. Integrate, complete, worship the forge, join the pattern. Each syllable carried intent, awareness, and judgment. I stepped closer to the central crucible, noting the full extent of hybrid integration. Neural readings indicated complete fusion of flesh, metal, and warp energy. Faces emerged briefly, recognizing observers, then melting back into the molten mass. The forge was not static. It was adaptive, learning from each engagement. It calculated our presence, testing reactions, and evolving the ritual in real time. The moral and tactical dilemma became immediate. Any attempt at containment risked total integration. Observation alone invited assimilation. Survival required precise understanding and caution. Then, at the far end of the chamber, the otherworldly light revealed something new. A suspended lattice of geometric shapes, metallic and organic, aligned in perfect ritual precision. The light pulsated through them, casting shifting shadows that resembled humanoid forms in prayer. I recognized the motif. The crucible forms, the corridor shapes, the skeletal appendages. They converged here, forming a central altar. It was not merely a forge. It was a cathedral of assimilation, a nexus of flesh, metal, and warp. A tremor shook the chamber. The molten crucible erupted, sending rivulets across the floor that reformed into hybrid assemblies. One detached and approached, moving deliberately, bifurcating limbs tracing patterns in the air. I sensed a probe of awareness, a test. The whispering became distinct, a single phrase repeating in resonance with the crucible. We hunger. You will feed the pattern. The hybrids flinched only when directed by the central lattice. Observation and hesitation were recognized. I understood that the forge was not merely alive, it was intelligent, purposeful, and patient. I recorded everything: neural interface capturing environmental anomalies, warp resonance, hybrid movement, and ritual sequences. Every observation brought a partial understanding. The forge was a living system of worship and assimilation, encoding human and mechanical consciousness into its structure. Each pulse, each whisper, each flicker of molten metal reinforced the incomprehensible intelligence behind the liturgy. As I advanced toward the central lattice, the floor beneath us rippled like a pulse, and the whispering reached a crescendo. We hunger. We await the next step. You are observed. The hybrids parted, forming a path forward, while shadows along the walls twisted, forming skeletal hands that beckoned. I understood that crossing the chamber would bring us deeper into the forge's liturgy. Resistance was optional. Observation was mandatory. Survival would depend on comprehension, and comprehension required crossing into the crucible's heart. The central lattice loomed before us, a cathedral of alloy and sinew pulsating with warped light that seemed to breathe. My hand hovered over the neural interface, recording every micro-shift, every fluctuation of temperature and gravity. The hybrids parted as we advanced, their limbs bifurcating in perfect ritual precision, guiding a path deeper into the forge. The whispering had evolved, forming coherent phrases. We hunger. You will feed. You will complete the pattern. Observation now felt like participation. Hesitation, a provocation. I stepped onto the first platform, a suspended lattice of molten metal and fused bone. It shifted under my weight, responding with a low-frequency resonance that vibrated through my robes and neural implants. The air carried the scent of scorched flesh and cold metal simultaneously, each inhalation a paradox of sensation. My servitors advanced cautiously, their sensors flickering erratically as though trying to interpret patterns too complex for their programming. Every movement we made was noted, analyzed, integrated. The hybrids moved around us, partially human, partially machine, eyes glowing with warped intelligence. One paused near the edge of the platform, reaching toward me with a bifurcated appendage. A faint psychic pulse emanated from it, probing my neural link, testing comprehension and resolve. I felt my own thoughts mirrored and distorted, suggestions implanted as if part of the forge itself were speaking. Join, integrate, serve the liturgy. I resisted, documenting the psychic intrusion, while noting that my awareness alone had become a variable in the forge's calculations. I ordered a scan of the crucible hybrids. Readings indicated full integration of human memory, neural pathways, and partial warp-touched intelligence. Every hybrid acted as both observer and participant, contributing to the ritual lattice of the forge. The whispering intensified as one approached, its movements deliberate, limbs tracing geometric patterns across the air. I realized that each gesture, each shift, was part of a liturgical calculus I could not yet fully comprehend. The hybrids were both priests and worshippers, encoding observation into ritual. A sudden tremor shook the platform. The molten metal beneath my feet split, forming tendrils that reached upward and bifurcated, probing at the air. One wrapped briefly around my robes, cold and pulsating. I felt the psychic resonance again, probing memory, intention, and fear. The whispering became louder, layered. We hunger, complete, merge, integrate. My servitors recoiled but maintained formation. The environment itself had become an extension of the forge's will, a conscious, adaptive liturgy of assimilation. I advanced toward the central crucible within the lattice. Its surface undulated, molten metal flowing like blood through veins, forming temporary faces of missing personnel. Eyes blinked, recognizing observers, then melted away. Neural scans indicated residual consciousness within the crucible, perfectly synchronized with the hybrid's movements and the lattice's rhythm. Observation, hesitation, and calculation had become variables in a larger equation of assimilation. Survival depended on comprehension. Comprehension depended on proximity. The whispering clarified a phrase that struck me with cold realization. All who enter, feed the pattern. All who observe, serve. I understood then the stakes of our presence. Observation alone was no longer neutral. It was participation in the forge's liturgy. Every recording, every probe, every microstep we took contributed to the expansion of the anomaly. My conscience trembled, forced to acknowledge the ethical calculus, intervene and risk assimilation of the hybrids, or remain observers and enable the forge's growth. A hybrid detached itself from the central crucible, limbs forming multiple tendrils that trace geometric symbols in the air. The whispering in my neural link became a direct psychic probe. You are watched. You are known. Serve the pattern. I forced myself to document, noting thermal inversions, microgravity fluctuations, and the adaptive geometry of fused flesh and metal. The hybrid's actions were deliberate, ritualized, precise. Each gesture, each pulse of the crucible, carried meaning encoded across multiple sensory channels. I directed the engine seers to maintain a perimeter while I advanced. One of the probes returned readings of partial human memory integrated into the central lattice. Faces flickered, recognizing me, some familiar, others distorted by fusion. I realized that these hybrids were repositories of experience, preserving knowledge while simultaneously feeding the forge's growth. Every step forward increased risk, yet yielded critical intelligence. The moral dilemma intensified. Our intrusion was both research and potential damnation. The platform shifted underfoot. The crucible pulsed violently, sending rivulets across the lattice that reformed into temporary hybrid assemblies. Limbs bifurcated, torsos extended, and faces emerged in gestures of worship, dissolving back into the molten lattice. The whispering became a chant. Complete the pattern, merge, serve, feed. Observation had become active participation, each neural recording assimilated into the forge's intelligence. Resistance now carried consequences beyond physical harm. It risked psychic integration. I paused at the edge of the platform, neural interface recording all sensory and environmental data. The hybrids parted, forming a corridor of molten and flesh lattice leading to an even deeper chamber. The central crucible pulsed with intent, projecting psychic probes that sought comprehension of our moral and tactical choices. Every hesitation, every glance, every micro-movement was integrated into the forge's pattern. The whispering repeated one last phrase, chilling in its clarity. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. I took a measured step forward, understanding that each movement would be recorded, cataloged, and possibly integrated. Observation had become participation. Survival would depend on comprehension, and comprehension required navigating the crucible lattice without succumbing to the psychic intrusion. The forge awaited, patient, sentient, and deliberate. The moral choice loomed: intervene and risk assimilation, or observe and enable expansion. Either path carried horror beyond imagining. The corridor ahead pulsed with the rhythm of molten metal and warp resonance. Each step sent micro-vibrations through the floor, relaying through my neural implants and reverberating in my robes. The hybrids moved in perfect synchrony around the lattice, limbs bifurcating and recombining, torsos and faces shifting in grotesque worship. I advanced cautiously, data slate active, recording thermal anomalies, psychic resonance, and structural flux. Observation alone had become an act of participation, each recorded datum integrated into the forge's liturgy. Suddenly, a hybrid detached from the central crucible, moving toward us with deliberate purpose. Limbs bifurcated into multiple appendages, each tracing geometric patterns in the air. Neural readings indicated partial awareness of the engine seers, synchronized with the crucible's pulse. I noted with dread that the hybrid's psychic probe was active, reaching toward my mind with invasive intent. The whispering became coherent thought. Serve. Integrate. Complete the pattern. Instinct screamed retreat, but the corridor had closed behind us. Reshaped by the forge's will, one engine seer froze, optic sensors twitching violently. The hybrid's appendage struck him, and he convulsed as molten metal fused with flesh. Neural scans indicated partial assimilation, consciousness intact, but awareness redirected toward the forge's ritual calculus. His screams were silent, emitted only as psychic echoes, and his body became an instrument of the crucible. I recorded everything with trembling hands, noting the speed and precision of the assimilation. Observation had become horror. The remaining servitors advanced, weapons ready, yet the hybrids anticipated every movement. Limbs bifurcated, forming barriers and tendrils that deflected attacks. One hybrid moved with preternatural speed, striking a servitor and fusing it into the floor lattice. Neural feedback indicated residual awareness, fully integrated into the forge. I felt a psychic pulse as if the hybrid observed my hesitation, probing my decision-making process. The whispering grew louder, layered. You are next. I'll serve, I'll feed. Complete the pattern. I directed probes into the central crucible. Thermal and neural readings indicated acceleration of assimilation. Faces of previous observers flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisted into new configurations, and limbs extended as if to reach for us. Gravity shifted violently, pulling my robes and implants in impossible directions. I braced against a conduit as the whispering became a chant, repeating in multiple harmonics, integrate, worship, merge, serve. Every sensory channel was assaulted. Sight, sound, temperature, overloading perception without breaking consciousness. A hybrid moved directly in front of me, bifurcated limbs tracing the air, forming symbols that resonated with my neural link. Its face flickered with the visage of a missing engine seer, eyes blinking with recognition and awareness. The psychic intrusion deepened. Memory, intention, and fear were probed, cataloged, and reflected. Observation had become participation. Hesitation was measured and calculated. I understood the stakes. The forge would not stop until all who entered were integrated, conscious or not. One of the remaining engine seers attempted intervention. Weapon raised, but the hybrid reacted instantly. Limbs shot out, immobilizing him, then partially fused his body into the lattice. Neural scans indicated full absorption. Consciousness redirected toward the forge's ritual. The whispering became a choir of merged voices. Complete the pattern. All serve. All feed. The air shimmered with energy as gravity, temperature, and psychic resonance oscillated violently. Observation alone had consequences. Inaction was assimilation. I activated a ritual diagnostic, attempting to shield my mind from the psychic probes. The hybrids reacted, limbs forming barriers and extending toward the central crucible. I recorded geometric alignments, thermal fluctuations, and neural readings. The lattice pulsed, emitting a low-frequency resonance that resonated directly with the hybrids. One detached and moved toward me, probing my neural link, testing comprehension and fear. Its eyes, flickering between familiar faces and molten abstraction, conveyed intelligence beyond calculation. The corridor shifted again, funneling us toward the central crucible. Limbs and torsos of hybrids formed a channel, guiding our movement with deliberate precision. The whispering repeated, layered and coherent. Serve, merge, integrate, feed. I realized the forge's intent was not merely consumption, but indoctrination, encoding our actions, memories, and hesitation into the lattice. Every second delayed increased the probability of assimilation. Observation alone was participation. As we approached the central crucible, one hybrid surged, tentacle-like appendages lashing outward. It struck another engine seer, fusing him partially into molten metal and machinery. Neural readings indicated full cognitive assimilation. Identity preserved only as functional subroutine within the forge. The psychic probe targeted me directly, a flood of sensation, memory, and distorted thought. My heart raced, robes clinging under microgravity fluctuations, and the whispering reached its apex. We hunger. You are observed. Complete the pattern. I braced against a platform as the crucible pulsed violently, molten rivulets erupting to form new hybrid assemblies. Faces of missing personnel flickered in horror, their eyes recognizing us even as their bodies dissolved. The hybrids moved in synchrony, performing gestures of worship and integration. Neural data indicated partial warp-touch transformations occurring spontaneously, accelerating assimilation and ritual progression. Observation had become engagement. Hesitation risked psychic consumption. I recorded all sensory, environmental, and neural data while preparing the servitors for limited containment measures. The forge responded instantly, bifurcating limbs, forming barriers, and extending psychic probes. The whispering repeated one final chilling phrase as we advanced into the next corridor. We hunger, all serve, none escape. The next step is inevitable. The corridor ahead twisted unnaturally, bending angles and distances that defied both architecture and instinct. Gravity oscillated violently, forcing me to anchor against molten conduits that pulsed like veins. The hybrids moved with uncanny synchronicity, bifurcated limbs tracing geometric patterns that extended across walls and ceiling, forming a lattice of ritual and observation. The air was thick, oscillating between scalding heat and sudden freezing, carrying the scent of scorched flesh mixed with metallic tang. My neural implants registered impossible fluctuations, temperature, gravity, and psychic resonance all conflicting in a temporal rhythm that made comprehension unstable. As I advanced, the central crucible's light pulsed irregularly, casting grotesque shadows that seemed to twist independently of the hybrids. Faces of previously assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes blinking in recognition, before dissolving back into the lattice. Neural scans indicated a complex overlay of warp-touched intelligence and human memory, forming a composite consciousness of both worshipper and consumed. Observation alone had become a form of participation, each recorded microstep feeding the crucible's liturgy. Suddenly, a surge of warp energy swept through the corridor. Microgravity inverted violently, tossing robes and equipment while thermal fluctuations reached lethal extremes. The hybrids reacted instantly, limbs bifurcating to stabilize pathways and protect the lattice. One moved directly toward me, probing my neural link with psychic resonance so strong it nearly overwhelmed my perception. Thoughts, memories, and sensations were mirrored, distorted, and projected back, forcing me to confront my own fears, failures, and ambitions simultaneously. The whispering became a chorus of layered intent. Serve, merge, complete, integrate. I attempted a ritual diagnostic to stabilize perception, tracing sigils in the air while chanting the Omnissiah litany. The corridor responded, walls flexed like sinew, molten rivulets forming appendages that probed at both mind and body. Faces of missing engine seers appeared in the rivulets, their eyes pleading and accusing in the same instant. Neural feedback indicated partial assimilation of observation itself, as if merely watching contributed to the forge's intelligence. Moral calculus collided with survival instinct, each second dealt. A had risked psychic consumption, yet every action carried ethical consequences. The central crucible pulsed again, and a section of the corridor split open. From the molten fissure, a hybrid erupted, its body a lattice of sinew and alloy, torsos stacked like an obscene choir, limbs extended in ritualistic gestures, bifurcating and reforming to interact with environmental glyphs that pulsed with warp energy. The whispering became intelligible thought. We hunger. All who enter feed the pattern, none escape. Its gaze locked on me through multiple faces embedded within its structure, probing for comprehension and hesitation. Microgravity shifted suddenly, causing the platform beneath me to tilt at impossible angles. I anchored against a conduit, recording thermal, gravitational, and psychic readings in rapid succession. The hybrids moved adaptively, forming barriers and extending probes, guiding or coercing movement toward the crucible's heart. The air thickened, vibrating with energy that penetrated both physical and neural senses. Observation had become hazardous. Perception itself risked assimilation. I noted the partial warp touch transformations, subtle distortions of visual fields, auditory resonance overlaying thought, and fleeting tactile anomalies that suggested the forge was reconfiguring reality around us. I advanced further, neural interface capturing every sensory anomaly. The central crucible pulsed violently, molten rivulets forming humanoid figures performing grotesque worship. Faces of missing personnel flickered in recognition, eyes wide with consciousness trapped in fusion. The hybrids traced patterns across the chamber, their bifurcated limbs interacting with environmental glyphs, reinforcing the ritual lattice. Observation alone now acted as participation, each microstep integrated into the forge's liturgy. My morality was under assault. Action risked assimilation, inaction enabled expansion. A psychic pulse struck my neural link directly, projecting warped imagery of infinite crucibles and hybrid assemblies. I felt my consciousness stretch and compress, memory and perception merging with environmental feedback. The whispering became a coherent chant, all serve, all feed, complete the pattern. My robes clung under oscillating gravity, sweat and ash coating my face. I realized that my comprehension of the forge was evolving alongside it, each observation altering both the anomaly and my own perception. I could no longer distinguish between observer and participant. One of the hybrids surged toward me, limbs bifurcating into probes that traced geometric motifs across my neural interface. Memory, intention, and fear were cataloged instantly, reflected, and partially absorbed. The crucible pulsed again, molten rivulets forming humanoid torsos that extended appendages toward me, urging both participation and worship. Environmental anomalies intensified, temperature spikes, gravity inversions, and warp resonance overlaid into a cacophony that threatened to unmake comprehension itself. I recorded all data, documenting the convergence of environmental, biological, and psychic anomalies. Neural readings indicated subtle warp-touch transformations in my perception. Visual fields stretched unnaturally, auditory patterns overlaid thought, and tactile feedback merged with psychic resonance. Observation had become assimilation, comprehension mandatory. The whispering repeated, layered and precise. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. The corridor ahead pulsed violently, opening into a chamber of even greater warp distortion. The hybrids formed a channel, limbs bifurcating to guide or coerce movement. Faces of missing personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes recognizing us even as bodies dissolved. I understood fully that we were crossing into the Forge's heart, where observation, action, and moral decision would converge with the first irreversible transformations. My perception, morality, and very identity were already shifting in response to the Forge's liturgy. Resistance was optional. Comprehension was compulsory. The chamber beyond the corridor was alive in ways I could barely comprehend. Gravity fluctuated violently, swinging between crushing and inverted, while the air vibrated with the resonance of molten metal and warp energy. The hybrids moved with deliberate synchronicity, bifurcated limbs tracing geometric patterns across the chamber. The central crucible pulsed with rhythmic intensity, casting grotesque shadows of fused torsos and faces that seemed to breathe independently. The whispering became intelligible, layered with psychic cadence. All serve, all feed, none escape. Complete the pattern. As we advanced, one engine seer froze, optic sensors flickering violently. Limbs of molten metal erupted from the crucible, reaching outward, bifurcating to immobilize him. His body convulsed as sinew fused with alloy, neural pathways partially assimilated into the lattice. The psychic echo of his fear reverberated through my neural link. Observation had transformed into participation. Every microsecond, every hesitation became a contribution to the Forge's intelligence. I documented the fusion in meticulous detail, knowing that survival now depended on comprehension as much as action. The remaining servitors advanced cautiously, weapons ready but ineffective against the hybrid's adaptive responses. Limbs bifurcated, forming barriers and conduits that deflected assaults. One hybrid surged forward, wrapping tendrils around a servitor, fusing it partially into the molten lattice. Neural readings confirmed cognitive assimilation. Awareness redirected toward the Forge's ritual, identity partially preserved only as a functional subroutine. The whispering became a choir of multiple voices. Complete, integrate, serve, feed. Resistance had consequences beyond physical destruction. Hesitation risked psychic consumption. I advanced toward the central crucible, neural interface recording every anomaly. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes blinking in recognition, torsos twisting into new ritualistic positions. The hybrids moved in synchrony, tracing symbols in the air that resonated with warp energy and environmental glyphs. Observation had become an act of worship, comprehension mandatory, survival precarious. I realized the moral calculus: intervene and risk full assimilation, or observe and enable further expansion. The crucible pulsed violently. A hybrid detached, approaching me directly. Its bifurcated limbs traced geometric patterns that resonated through my neural implants, probing memory, intention, and fear. The whispering became thought, clear and insistent. Join, complete, serve the pattern, integrate. My robes clung under oscillating gravity, sweat and ash coating my face. The hybrids anticipated hesitation, adapting instantaneously, making every micro-movement a variable in the Forge's liturgy. One engine seer attempted to fire a weapon, but the hybrid reacted preternaturally. Limbs extended, striking him, and molten metal fused with his body. Neural scans indicated full cognitive assimilation. Awareness preserved, redirected, and integrated into the crucible lattice. The whispering layered over my thoughts, a symphony of intent. All serve, all feed. You are observed. I realized fully that observation alone was no longer passive. Hesitation was measured, cataloged, and used to adapt the Forge. I stepped closer to the crucible. The molten rivulets reshaped themselves into humanoid forms, torsos fused with metal and sinew, faces flickering in recognition. The hybrids traced ritual patterns, their bifurcated limbs encoding every detail of our presence. Neural feedback indicated partial warp touch transformation. Visual fields stretched unnaturally. Auditory perception overlaid with psychic resonance. Tactile sensation merged with environmental energy. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension was a survival requirement. Then the first irreversible transformation occurred. One engine seer, partially fused and conscious, extended his remaining limbs toward me. His face flickered with fear, recognition, and warped awareness. Neural readings indicated complete integration with the crucible lattice. Identity preserved only as functional extension of the Forge. The whispering repeated insistently. Complete. Integrate. Serve. All feed. The moral choice crystallized. Intervene to free him. risking further assimilation, or allow integration, ensuring survival but sacrificing a soul. I activated ritual diagnostics, attempting to shield my neural link while assessing possible intervention. The hybrid reacted instantly, bifurcated limbs forming barriers, probing both thought and perception. The crucible pulsed violently, molten rivulets reshaping into new hybrid assemblies. Faces of missing personnel flickered, torsos twisting into gestures of worship. Observation alone had consequences. Every hesitation, every decision fed the forge. I realized that partial intervention could accelerate assimilation, while inaction guaranteed moral compromise. Gravity inverted again, forcing me to anchor against a conduit. The hybrids adapted, guiding our movement toward the central lattice. The whispering intensified, layered with psychic resonance. Serve, merge, integrate, feed. You are observed. I documented every thermal, gravitational, and neural anomaly, knowing that survival depended on understanding the forge's pattern, as much as avoiding physical or psychic destruction. The corridor ahead opened into a chamber of greater warp distortion. The hybrids formed a channel, bifurcated limbs guiding movement while projecting psychic probes. Faces of previously assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes recognizing us even as bodies dissolved. The crucible pulsed with intent, forcing moral and tactical choices. Observation had become engagement. Hesitation risked irreversible assimilation. Action risked ethical collapse. I paused at the threshold, neural interface capturing all sensory and environmental data. The first engine seer had been lost, partially integrated into the crucible's intelligence. The hybrids pulsed, and the whispering repeated one final chilling phrase. We hunger. You are observed. Complete the pattern. None escape. Survival demanded comprehension. Comprehension required crossing into the crucible's heart. And the moral choice, the first irreversible sacrifice, loomed over every subsequent step. We crossed the final threshold into the heart of the crucible, where molten metal-infused flesh formed a cathedral of incomprehensible scale. Gravity oscillated violently, swinging between crushing force and inverted pull, while air vibrated with layered warp resonance. Hybrids moved with terrifying precision, limbs bifurcating and tracing geometric patterns across walls and ceiling. The central crucible pulsed, illuminating faces of previously assimilated personnel embedded in molten rivulets, eyes blinking in conscious awareness. Observation had become participation. Hesitation risked psychic absorption. The whispering intensified, layered with psychic cadence. All serve, all feed, none escape. Complete the pattern. Neural implants flared with feedback. Every micro-movement was cataloged and integrated into the forge's liturgy. Thermal fluctuations oscillated between extreme heat and sudden cold, sending rivulets of molten metal to rise like tendrils. Each step forced a moral and tactical decision. Intervene and risk assimilation, or observe and enable the forge's expansion. The corridor behind us had vanished, reshaped into a channel of molten sinew guiding movement deeper into the crucible's heart. The hybrids surged forward, one detached from the lattice, approaching with bifurcated limbs that probed my neural interface directly. Thoughts, memories, and intentions were mirrored, distorted, and reflected back, forcing confrontation with fear, guilt, and ambition. The whispering became intelligible. Serve, integrate, complete the pattern, merge. My robes clung under oscillating gravity, sweat and ash coating my face. Observation alone had become an act of worship. Comprehension had become a survival requirement. I directed probes into the crucible. Neural readings indicated acceleration of assimilation. Torsos and faces of missing personnel flickered in molten rivulets, limbs extending to form new hybrid assemblies. Gravity and thermal anomalies intensified. Microgravity inverted suddenly, then returned to crushing weight. Auditory sensors captured overlapping resonance. Mechanical, biological, and psychic layers converging into a cacophony of worship and consumption. Every second delayed increased both psychic risk and moral compromise. One engine seer attempted to intervene with tools, but the hybrid anticipated and reacted preternaturally. Limbs wrapped around him, fusing metal and flesh. Neural scans confirmed full cognitive assimilation. Identity preserved only as a functional subroutine within the crucible lattice. The whispering layered over my thoughts, merging observation, hesitation, and action into a single psychic calculus. All serve. All feed. You are observed. Complete the pattern. I realized that intervention carried consequences as dire as inaction. Survival required precision, comprehension, and moral compromise. The central crucible pulsed violently. Molten rivulets erupted, forming humanoid figures whose torsos twisted into gestures of worship. Faces flickered in recognition, eyes wide with consciousness trapped within fusion. Hybrids moved in synchrony, limbs bifurcating to trace patterns that reinforced the lattice's ritual geometry. Neural feedback indicated warp-touched transformations. Visual fields stretched unnaturally. Auditory perception overlaid with psychic resonance. Tactile feedback merged with environmental energy. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension and moral navigation were inseparable from survival. Suddenly, a surge of warp energy reshaped the chamber. Gravity inverted and oscillated violently, forcing me to anchor against a molten conduit. The air thickened, vibrating with energy that penetrated both physical and neural senses. Hybrids responded adaptively, bifurcated limbs forming barriers, conducting ritual gestures, and projecting psychic probes. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes following movement, torsos twisting into new forms. Observation and hesitation were now variables in the Forge's evolving intelligence. I advanced closer to the Crucible's heart, neural interface capturing all sensory anomalies. The central lattice pulsed violently, molten rivulets forming new hybrid assemblies, limbs bifurcated, tracing geometric patterns across walls, ceiling, and floor. The whispering became an overwhelming choir. Serve, merge, integrate, feed. You are observed. Complete the pattern. Thermal, gravitational, and psychic feedback overlapped in a rhythm that assaulted perception without breaking consciousness. Each recorded action contributed to the Forge's intelligence. Hesitation risked partial assimilation. Action risked moral collapse. One hybrid surged directly at me, bifurcated limbs tracing symbols across my neural implants. Memory, intention, and fear were cataloged instantly, reflected and partially absorbed. The Crucible pulsed violently again, molten rivulets forming torsos that extended appendages toward me, urging participation and worship. Environmental anomalies intensified. Gravity spikes, temperature extremes, warp resonance overlaying thought, and tactile sensation merging with psychic feedback. Observation had become assimilation, moral and tactical decisions inseparable from survival. I paused at the Crucible's edge, documenting environmental, neural, and psychic anomalies. The hybrids formed a corridor, limbs bifurcating to guide or coerce movement deeper into the lattice. Faces of missing personnel flickered in molten rivulets, eyes recognizing us even as bodies dissolved. The Crucible pulsed with intent, projecting psychic probes that assessed comprehension and hesitation. The whispering repeated one final phrase, layered and precise. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. Complete the pattern. Survival now demanded crossing fully into the Crucible's heart, where observation, action, and moral choice would converge with irreversible consequences. The chamber collapsed around perception itself. Gravity shifted violently, swinging from crushing pressure to inverted pull, while the air vibrated with overlapping warp resonance. Molten metal rippled through the floor and walls, forming bifurcated appendages that reached toward us with deliberate intelligence. The hybrids moved with terrifying synchronicity, torsos and faces flickering in molten rivulets, eyes blinking in conscious recognition. Observation had become participation. Hesitation risked psychic absorption. Action risked moral compromise. The whispering was omnipresent, layered with intent. All serve, all feed, none escape. Complete the pattern. Every micro-movement, every thought, every hesitation was cataloged into the Crucible's liturgy. Thermal extremes fluctuated violently, from scorching heat to sudden freezing, forcing servitors to brace against bifurcating conduits. Neural implants struggled to stabilize perception, yet sensory feedback continued to merge with warp resonance, twisting thought and memory. The Forge was no longer merely adaptive. It was consuming comprehension itself. One hybrid surged forward, limbs bifurcating into probes that traced geometric symbols across the chamber. Neural readings indicated partial cognitive assimilation of my own thought patterns. Memories of past failures, ambitions, and fears projected back and distorted. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting into worship gestures, eyes following each movement. The whispering became a coherent, direct psychic command: integrate, serve, merge, complete the pattern. Observation and hesitation were now inseparable from psychic assault. The central crucible pulsed violently. Molten rivulets erupted, forming humanoid figures whose limbs bifurcated and recombined in grotesque choreography. Torsos twisted, faces emerged and dissolved, and every gesture seemed to encode both worship and observation. Thermal and gravitational anomalies intensified. The floor flexed like muscle, walls shifted with conscious intent, and air pulsed with resonance that penetrated neural implants directly. Every recorded datum became part of the Forge's expanding intelligence. Survival depended on comprehension. Comprehension required moral and tactical precision. The advanced neural interface recording environmental, psychic, and sensory anomalies. A hybrid detached from the central lattice, approaching with bifurcated limbs that probed directly into my neural link. Thought, memory, and intention were mirrored and distorted, forcing confrontation with both fear and guilt. The whispering layered over perception, forming coherent phrases. All serve. All feed, you are observed. Complete the pattern. The corridor behind had vanished, replaced by molten sinew forming channels of ritual guidance. Observation was mandatory. Hesitation was measured. One engine seer attempted intervention with a tool, but the hybrid reacted preternaturally, limbs wrapping around him and fusing metal with flesh. Neural scans confirmed full cognitive assimilation. Awareness preserved only as functional extension of the crucible lattice. The whispering became a choir of overlapping voices. Merge, integrate, serve, complete. The pattern. I realized fully that every decision carried consequences beyond physical survival. Every choice altered both moral standing and psychic integrity. The central crucible pulsed again, molten rivulets forming humanoid assemblies, torsos twisting into gestures of worship. Faces flickered in recognition, eyes wide with consciousness trapped within fusion. Hybrids moved in perfect synchrony, tracing geometric patterns across walls, ceiling, and floor, reinforcing the lattice's ritual geometry. Neural feedback indicated subtle warp-touch transformations. Visual perception stretched unnaturally, auditory resonance overlaid thought, tactile sensation merged with psychic feedback. Observation had become assimilation. Survival demanded comprehension under extreme conditions. A surge of warp energy reshaped the chamber. Gravity and thermal extremes fluctuated violently, forcing me to anchor against molten conduits that flexed like sinew. The hybrids adapted instantly, forming barriers, guiding movement, and projecting psychic probes. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting to trace ritual gestures. Observation and hesitation were now variables in the crucible's intelligence. I understood that any misstep could result in full assimilation, both psychic and moral. I stepped closer to the central crucible, neural interface capturing all anomalies. The crucible pulsed violently, molten rivulets forming torsos and limbs that extended toward me, demanding participation and observation. Hybrids traced geometric patterns, encoding every micro-movement, hesitation, and thought into the Forge's intelligence. Sensory and psychic feedback merged with environmental anomalies. Gravity, temperature, and warp resonance assaulted every sense simultaneously. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension was inseparable from survival. Then the first irreversible transformation struck me directly. Neural feedback indicated subtle warp-touched changes, perception distorted, memory overlaid with psychic resonance, and tactile sensation merged with environmental feedback. Observation had crossed into assimilation. Faces of missing personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting in worship gestures, eyes tracking movement even as bodies dissolved. The whispering repeated one final phrase, layered and precise. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. Complete the pattern. Survival now demanded navigating the crucible's heart, where moral choice and comprehension would determine both psychic integrity and physical survival. The central crucible's heart pulsated with an intelligence both alien and intimately aware. Gravity fluctuated violently, alternately pressing me into molten conduits and lifting me toward the warped ceiling. Air vibrated with overlapping resonance. Mechanical, biological, and psychic layers merged into a single, incomprehensible pattern. The hybrids moved with terrifying precision, limbs bifurcating to trace geometric rituals across every surface. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting in perpetual worship. Observation had become participation. Hesitation risked assimilation. Action demanded moral compromise. The whispering intensified, layered and omnipresent. All serve. All feed, none escape. Complete the pattern. Every micro-movement, every thought, every hesitation was catalogued and integrated into the forge's liturgy. Thermal extremes oscillated from lethal heat to sudden freezing, forcing servitors to brace against bifurcating conduits. Neural implants flared with feedback. Every observation became participation, every hesitation a contribution to the crucible's expanding intelligence. The forge was no longer merely adaptive. It was consuming comprehension itself. A hybrid surged toward me, bifurcated limbs tracing geometric symbols across neural implants. Memories, intentions, and fears were mirrored and distorted, projecting an image of myself participating willingly in the liturgy. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting in grotesque worship gestures, eyes following each micro-movement. The whispering became intelligible thought. Integrate, serve, merge, complete the pattern. Observation alone was now an act of psychic and moral engagement. The central crucible pulsed violently. Molten rivulets erupted, forming humanoid figures whose limbs bifurcated and recombined in grotesque choreography. Torsos twisted, faces emerged and dissolved, every gesture encoding both worship and observation. Thermal and gravitational anomalies intensified. The floor flexed like muscle, walls shifted with conscious intent, and air pulsed with resonance that penetrated neural implants directly. Every recorded action became part of the forge's expanding intelligence. Survival depended on comprehension. Comprehension demanded moral and tactical precision. I advanced toward the crucible's core. One hybrid detached, approaching with bifurcated limbs that probed neural links directly. Thought, memory, and intention were mirrored, distorted, and partially absorbed. The whispering layered over perception. All serve. All feed. You are observed. Complete the pattern. The corridor behind had vanished, replaced by molten sinew channels guiding deeper movement. Observation was mandatory. Hesitation measured and integrated. The first irreversible transformation of my perception became undeniable. Visual fields stretched unnaturally. Auditory resonance overlaid thought, and tactile sensation merged with environmental energy. Faces of missing personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting in worship gestures, eyes tracking micro-movements even as bodies dissolved. Neural feedback confirmed subtle warp-touch changes. Comprehension and moral calculus intertwined with psychic resonance. Observation had become assimilation. Survival required navigating moral and tactical imperatives simultaneously. One engineer attempted intervention with tools, but the hybrid anticipated and reacted preternaturally. Limbs wrapped around him, fusing metal with flesh. Neural scans confirmed full cognitive assimilation. Awareness preserved only as functional extension of the crucible lattice. The whispering became a choir. Merge, integrate, serve, complete the pattern. Every action, hesitation, and decision contributed to the forge's evolving intelligence. Moral choice and survival were inseparable. Observation was now both participation and corruption. The crucible pulsed again, molten rivulets forming humanoid assemblies. Limbs bifurcated, tracing geometric patterns across walls, ceiling, and floor. Neural feedback indicated warp-touch transformations in both myself and my remaining servitors. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension was inseparable from survival. The whispering repeated, "We hunger. You are observed." The next step is inevitable. Complete the pattern. I advanced to the crucible's center. Molten rivulets erupted violently, forming humanoid torsos that extended appendages toward me, urging both participation and observation. The hybrids responded adaptively, bifurcating limbs to block and guide movement. Thermal, gravitational, and psychic anomalies overlapped, assaulting every sense. Observation had become assimilation. Hesitation risked permanent integration. Moral and tactical choice were fused. Act or submit, survive or become part of the crucible's intelligence. A surge of warp energy struck, and my perception fractured. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered, torsos twisting, eyes pleading and accusing simultaneously. The hybrids traced ritual patterns, encoding every micro-movement and hesitation. Neural implants overloaded briefly, confirming that partial warp-touch transformation was permanent. Observation had crossed the threshold. Comprehension, participation, and moral compromise were now inseparable from survival. The whispering reached a crescendo, layered and omnipresent. All serve. All feed. You are observed. Complete the pattern. None escape. I understood fully that every choice, every hesitation, every act of observation had contributed to the Forge's intelligence. Survival required crossing fully into the Crucible's heart, where psychic, moral, and physical consequences converged irreversibly. The final confrontation loomed, to act, to resist, or to integrate entirely. Observation had become engagement. Comprehension demanded full immersion in the Forge's liturgy. The Crucible's heart dominated perception entirely. Gravity oscillated violently, thermal extremes fluctuated unpredictably, and the air vibrated with layered warp resonance that penetrated neural implants directly. Hybrids moved with perfect synchronicity, bifurcated limbs tracing geometric rituals across every surface. Molten rivulets formed humanoid torsos and faces, flickering in recognition and consciousness. Observation had become total participation. Hesitation was now indistinguishable from engagement. The whispering rose to a deafening chorus, layered and omnipresent. All serve. All feed, none escape. Complete the pattern. Neural implants overloaded briefly with warp-touched feedback. Every micro-movement, every decision, every hesitation had been catalogued and partially absorbed into the Forge's intelligence. The remaining servitors advanced cautiously, weapons ineffective against the hybrid's adaptive responses. Limbs extended, bifurcating to form barriers, guide movement, and project psychic probes. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension demanded both moral and tactical acuity. I stepped closer to the central crucible, the molten lattice writhing with intelligence. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in rivulets of metal and flesh, torsos twisting in gestures of worship. Neural feedback confirmed that partial warp-touch transformation was irreversible. Perception, memory, and moral calculus were now entangled with the Crucible's intelligence. The whispering became thought. Integrate, serve, merge, complete the pattern. Every hesitation, every micro-action was part of the Forge's ritual. Survival was impossible without participation, yet participation risked permanent assimilation. One hybrid detached and surged toward me, bifurcated limbs probing directly into my neural interface. Memory, intention, and fear were mirrored, distorted, and partially absorbed. Faces of assimilated personnel blinked in molten rivulets, torsos twisting, eyes pleading and accusing simultaneously. The central crucible pulsed violently, molten rivulets forming humanoid assemblies, limbs bifurcating into intricate patterns of ritual and worship. Observation was total. Hesitation risked irreversible psychic integration. I activated ritual diagnostics in a last attempt to stabilize perception. Gravity inverted violently, throwing robes and equipment, while thermal fluctuations threatened to sear or freeze flesh instantly. The hybrids adapted instantly, limbs forming protective barriers around the crucible, guiding movement and projecting psychic probes. Faces of previously assimilated personnel flickered, torsos twisting in worship gestures. Every decision now carried consequences beyond physical survival. Moral, psychic, and ethical collapse were imminent. A surge of warp energy reshaped the chamber. Molten rivulets erupted violently, forming humanoid torsos that extended appendages toward me. Limbs bifurcated to probe and guide, projecting intent and observation. Neural implants signaled permanent warp-touch transformation. Visual fields stretched unnaturally. Auditory perception merged with psychic resonance. Tactile sensation fused with environmental anomalies. Observation had crossed the threshold into irreversible assimilation. Comprehension and moral navigation were inseparable from psychic and physical survival. I advanced to the crucible's core, aware that each micro-movement was catalogued and integrated. Hybrids traced geometric patterns across every surface, encoding hesitation, intention, and thought. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisting into gestures of worship, eyes following each movement. Neural feedback confirmed permanent warp-touch changes. The whispering layered over perception, clear and omnipresent. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. Complete the pattern. The final moral and tactical decision loomed. One remaining servitor, partially fused but conscious, reached toward me. Intervention risked further assimilation. Inaction guaranteed the loss of a soul. I hesitated, recording every sensory, psychic, and environmental anomaly. Gravity oscillated violently. Molten conduits flexed like sinew, and thermal extremes threatened immediate destruction. Observation had become engagement. Participation was unavoidable. I acted. Neural implants flared with warp-touched feedback as I intervened. attempting to stabilize the remaining servitor while navigating bifurcated limbs of hybrids and molten rivulets. The crucible pulsed violently, integrating action, hesitation, and thought into its intelligence. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered, torsos twisting, eyes wide with consciousness trapped in fusion. Observation, comprehension, and moral choice converged in a single irreversible act. When the crucible pulsed one final time, the chamber stabilized partially. Gravity normalized, thermal extremes receded slightly, but the whispering persisted. All serve. All feed, you are observed. Complete the pattern. The hybrids recoiled momentarily, then reformed, bifurcated limbs tracing new geometric rituals. The remaining servitor had been partially saved, but neural readings confirmed integration with the crucible lattice. Awareness preserved only as a functional extension of the forge. Moral victory had come at irreversible cost. I retreated toward the outer corridor, observing the lattice one last time. Faces of assimilated personnel flickered in molten rivulets, torsos twisted in worship gestures. The hybrids followed, bifurcated limbs tracing ritual patterns that encoded every observation, hesitation, and act. The whispering persisted, omnipresent and layered. We hunger. You are observed. Complete the pattern. Then escape. Observation had become assimilation. Comprehension had exacted a permanent moral and psychic toll. As the outer corridors stabilized, gravity normalized, and air resumed plausible density, I noted the consequences. The forge remained active, partially contained but fully aware of our intrusion. The remaining hybrids followed patterns of worship and observation, the crucible pulsating with intelligence that extended beyond the chamber. I had survived but partially integrated into the lattice myself. Observation, action, and moral choice had merged permanently with the forge. I recorded coordinates, sensory data, neural readings, and environmental anomalies. The forge could not be destroyed without catastrophic risk, yet containment was only temporary. The whispering lingered in my implants, subtle but omnipresent. We hunger. You are observed. The next step is inevitable. Complete the pattern. Survival had come at irreversible cost. Partial assimilation, permanent warp-touch perception, and moral compromise. The crucible remained, patient, sentient, and aware. A cathedral of horror beyond containment.